Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the key topics that Seneca will devote a lot of space to towards the end of his treatise on the happy life is the relationship between virtue and wealth, particularly for Stoics. Since the Stoics themselves will say things like wealth and poverty are not good or evil, but rather indifference, doesn't that mean that wealth is totally disconnected from the happy life? And the answer is yes and no. It's not quite so simple, let alone simplistic as that. And Seneca is really looking to deal with critics who would say, Seneca, to begin with, you Stoics should be trying to get away from wealth altogether, since you hold it in contempt or despise it, contemnere, right, in Latin. You should pass up wealth whenever you can, and you, Seneca, you're a rich guy, so you're really to blame when it comes to that. Although, as we'll see at the very end, he says, charge Plato for having sought money, Aristotle for having received it, Democritus for having neglected it, Epicurus for having consumed it. All of these are sort of off-base accusations in Seneca's view. So why would that be the case? He begins, this is in chapter 21, with this complaint. Why does this person study philosophy and live his life so wealthy? Why does he say wealth is to be scorned, to be despised, to, detach yourself from it, and yet he's got wealth? And then he goes on and gives some examples of other, what the Stoics call indifference. Why does he say life is to be scorned, yet live? And then health is to be scorned, yet watch his health carefully. And he thinks exile is an empty word and says, what harm is there in changing regions? Yet, if he can, he spends his old age in his homeland. And he holds there's no difference between a longer time and shorter time. Yet, if nothing prevents it, he extends his life and he flourishes peacefully in extreme old age. You Stoics, you're actually contradicting yourselves because you despise or scorn or look down upon all of these things, and yet you're totally cool with having them, and you even arrange your life in such a way as to have them, pursue them, and enjoy them. So Seneca has a response to this. He says those things ought to be scorned, but not that he will not have them. Right? So there's a wrong association of ideas. If you scorn something, then you will avoid having it. You will refuse it. You will get rid of it. And Seneca is saying that doesn't actually follow. Instead, we have to clarify what is the person scorning it so that they won't have them anxiously. Solicitus, being too concerned about them, making them a priority. So you don't have to get rid of wealth or health or any of these other things just because you realize the value that they have, which is actually not a full value. So he's going to go on and he's going to say, a wise person does not think himself unworthy of any fortuitous gifts. What is a fortuitous gift? It just happens to arrive for you. So, if you're a wise person and people happen to like you in your workplace, and you go in and it's your birthday, you didn't tell anybody, and they come out, surprise, happy birthday, we're taking you out for a meal, but first let's have some cake. If you're a wise person, you're not going to be like, oh, no, I contemn these sorts of things. I look down upon, scorn these. No, you're going to say, oh, how nice. If you're a wise person and you happen to win the lottery, you're not going to say, no, not okay for a wise person. I mean, how did you win the lottery at all? You had to pay to play, so you had to actually purchase a ticket. We could go into the, is a wise person actually going to purchase a lottery ticket? Probably not, right? But in any case, he says the wise person doesn't love wealth, amat, right? From amare, to love, but they prefer it, mavult, in that. Coming from maius, vele, which means to will more in relation to other things. So it prefers wealth to poverty, right? Nothing wrong about that. As a matter of fact, that's straight out Stoic doctrine about some things being preferable and other things being to be rejected, but not as things that are goods or evils, but things that are indifference. So he's going to go on, and this is in chapter 22. He's going to say something really quite interesting. What doubt is there that in wealth the wise person has greater material for unfurling his mind than he does in poverty? Now, unfurling his mind doesn't mean thinking about things. It means exercising the virtues that the wise person has. The cardinal virtues of practical wisdom or prudence, self-control or moderation, temperance, courage or fortitude, and justice. They are within the wise person, and having some wealth allows them to do more with it. They have greater material. There's a fuller scope, you could say, for virtue. And he's going to make a contrast here. It's not that you can't do anything when you're poor. He says, in poverty, the only kind of virtue is not being deterred or depressed. That's a little bit of an overstatement because he's going to talk a little bit later about uphill and downhill virtues. In Latin, inclinare, being turned towards something that you shouldn't. Deprimit, being depressed, being sad about that sort of stuff. So you resist those, and that requires courage or fortitude. What about when you actually have wealth? Well, you have opportunities for exercising all sorts of virtues, most of which fall under temperance as a whole or justice, right? So you have temperance, temperantia. This is one of the cardinal virtues. Liberality or generosity, liberalitas, right? Diligence, diligentia, following through on things. Management, dispositio. This is an interesting one. This means how you arrange the possessions, the assets that you actually have. And then finally, magnificence, which in ancient times meant doing good things for people like your friends or your city on a large scale. These are all possible when you have wealth, and they're not really possible when you have poverty. I mean, you could say temperance is certainly possible in poverty, but it's kind of tough to indulge yourself in too much food when you can't afford any food, or refrain from drinking too much wine when you can't get any access to it. And some of these others do depend on having wealth, liberality and magnificence, management. You've got to have some assets, some property, right? So he goes on and he says, the wise person, is going to try to take wealth and do good things with it. He says, you need to understand there are certain things that even if they're small within the larger scheme of things, and they can be taken away from a person without ruining the principal good, which is virtue, right? Nevertheless, they add something to the unending joy that comes into existence from virtue. Wealth affects him and exhilarates him. And it actually, the Latin term there is exhilarare, right? To make them cheerful, you could say. Like a favorable wind that pushes a sailor along, or a fine day and sunny spot during the cold depths of winter. And he goes on and he says, listen, these are things that we call indifference. Indifferentia in Latin, right? That's a Stoic technical term, but that doesn't mean that these things have no value whatsoever, pretii, right? And he even says, in se, in themselves. They do have some value. Wealth does have some value. It's just not the kind of value that is going to, by itself, give you the happy life, right? That requires virtue. And they are, in fact, preferable potiora to other things. So wealth is preferable to poverty. Health is preferable to illness. Living is preferable to dying. Living in your place is preferable to living in exile. But none of them are what make us genuinely happy. So he says, don't get it wrong. Wealth is among the preferables, right? So then how do the Stoics actually have wealth if they're going to live up to their Stoic philosophy? So there's a couple different criteria here. One is, he says, if wealth flows away from me, it will take nothing but itself. I'm not so invested, pun intended, in that wealth that if you take it away, I'm like, ooh, I lost a part of myself, right? How is it for people who don't have the right point of view on this? He says, you will be stunned, and it will seem to you that you are devoid of yourself. You've had a part of yourself taken away if wealth departs from you. So, when we think of wealth in this case, we could think of our money, right? We identify ourselves with money. But we might also think about our possessions, our property. We lose these things, and we're like, ooh, a bit of me has been taken. Well, no, because you're not your money, you're not your house, you're not your car, you're not, we could talk about intellectual property. You take all my videos away, I don't quit being who I am. I lose a lot of work that I've done over the years, which is my intellectual property, but I'm not going to lose being me if I have the right point of view. So if it flows away, it takes nothing but itself. What else? The Stoic is not going to accept ill-gotten good. Like he says, the wise person will not allow a single denarius, a very small coin, to make an entrance across his threshold if it's ill-gotten. So you're not going to pursue wealth by any means possible or necessary. And if you know that the money is coming from the wrong sources, you're not going to take it. But you're also not going to, as he says, reject or refuse gifts of fortune. If things, happen to turn out well for you, you're not going to say, oh, well, I'm a Stoic. I can't take any wealth from anybody. And you're especially not going to do so if they're the fruits of virtue. If you're a virtuous person, just as you talked about with pleasure, you're probably going to get some pleasure, but that's not the goal of virtue. You're probably also going to live a life that conduces to acquiring some wealth. And that's perfectly fine according to Seneca. The wise person is not going to say, oh, I'll throw that away. No, it's the opposite. And they'll give to good people or people that they can make good. By the way, Seneca has an entire work, one of his longer works called On Benefits, where he discusses giving at great length. It's well worth checking out and looking through if you're interested in this topic. He also does have a letter on benefits as well that you can check out. So they will give their wealth, and he says he will give, selecting with special care those who are most worthy, because he remembers he must give an account of his expenses just as much as what he received. Why is the person going to give from their wealth? Right and commendable reasons, because a bad gift is to be counted a shameful loss. So he also says, if someone thinks it's an easy thing to give,
he's off course. It's actually quite difficult if you're going to make informed donations rather than random and haphazard scatterings. To this person I do a favor, to that one I return one, this one I rescue, this one I take pity on. Another I provide for because he's worthy to be spared of the distraction and impediment of poverty. To certain people I will not give, no matter how much is lacking, because even if I give, it will be lacking. It's not going to do anything. To others I will offer, on others I will even tread. I need to pay attention to who I am giving. And here is something really quite interesting. So somebody says, oh, you're going to give with a view to receiving. So you're giving so that you get something back, right? Not out of generosity. And Seneca says, it's actually with a view to not wasting. Let a gift go somewhere from which it need not be sought back, but could be paid back, right? So these are interesting reflections. And he goes on a little bit further. And he says, it's not just about giving to people who have a lot of status. You ought to be giving within your household. He says, what does it matter whether the person be slave or free, freeborn or freed, possessing legal freedom or a freedom conferred by one friend on another? Wherever a human being is, there is a place for a favor or benefit. So money can be distributed within one's household. It can be an exercise in liberality. And he says, what makes a liberality is not that you're giving it to free people, right? Liberis, but because it originates in a free mind, libero. And he says, you can exercise this virtue within your own domestic affairs. So that's, quite important. A little bit later, he says, here's the reason why I do not count wealth as a good, and here what I contribute in the case of wealth that is different from what you people do, seeing as how we both agree it's to be acquired. Put me in a lavish house, put me where gold and silver are in common use. I'm not going to look at myself differently because of things that are outside of me. Wealth doesn't make us good people, doesn't give us the virtues, right? And it doesn't make our life happy, because what will actually make our life happy is cultivating the virtues. You can be as wealthy as you want and still be a miserable, person who just never has good things happening in their life because they don't have genuine goodness. Now, the last thing that we'll look at here is what he says by contrast about wise people and foolish people. He says, what difference is there between me, a fool, and you, a wise person, if we both wish to have wealth? In the case of the wise person, wealth is in servitude. Wealth works for, wealth is the servant of the wise person. The wise person is above their wealth. In the case of the fool, it's the opposite. They place it in command. They allow wealth to dominate their decision-making, their values, their orientations, their priorities. And because of this, they're a fool and they're going to be unhappy. He says the wise person gives no license to wealth. Your wealth gives you all manner of license. You people get accustomed to wealth and cling to it as if someone had promised you eternal possession of it. The wise person rehearses for poverty even when he stands amid wealth. And this is referring to a Stoic practice of, voluntary poverty for a day. Seneca actually talks about this in one of his other letters where he says, I'm a rich guy, but every so often I live like a poor person. Why? Just in case I actually do become poorer, I'll be able to actually handle it. So this is a great example of how the Stoics model what Seneca is talking about here. So we see that there is a big disconnect between virtue and wealth, and yet at the same time, they're not entirely disconnected. They're not opposites to each other. Virtue can use wealth wisely, justly, temperately, courageously, right? But wealth can't actually use virtue. So, which should we prefer? Obviously, virtue, but that doesn't mean that we have to reject wealth and not have any of it if we want to be virtuous people and have the happy life.